We picture Jesus walking through green hills, a mild breeze in the air, his robe clean and white. That image is wrong. What was it actually like to stand in the Judean lowlands in July? What happened to a laborer's body after 6 hours of harvest work under a sun that pushed temperatures past 110 degrees Fahrenheit? What did people drink? Where did they hide? And what did they know about surviving heat that we have completely forgotten? Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels. The land of first-century Judea was not a pastoral paradise. It was a semi-arid environment where summer heat was not an inconvenience. It was a threat. The Jordan Valley, one of the lowest points on the surface of the earth, sat in a geological depression that trapped heat like a furnace. The limestone hills around Jerusalem reflected light and radiated warmth long after sunset. The dry Mediterranean wind known as the Sharav, called the Sirocco in other regions, could arrive without warning and raise temperatures by 20 degrees in a matter of hours, desiccating skin, cracking lips, and draining the body of water faster than most people could replace it. This was the world Jesus walked through, not metaphorically, literally. And the people who lived there had developed, over centuries and millennia, a sophisticated body of practical knowledge about how to survive it. These were not written manuals. They were habits, instincts, architectural decisions, social customs and daily rhythms passed from grandmother to granddaughter, from master craftsman to apprentice, from village elder to young shepherd. They were embedded in the texture of daily life so completely that they were nearly invisible until you understand them. If this kind of deep historical context enriches your understanding of the scriptures, consider subscribing to this channel. There is much more of this world waiting to be uncovered, and every detail changes how you read the text. The first forgotten trick was not a technique, it was an understanding of time. In the villages of Galilee and the streets of Jerusalem, the day was not organized the way we organize ours. Work did not begin at 9 and end at 5. The rhythm of the day was dictated entirely by the sun. Before dawn, while the air still held the memory of the night's coolness, men were already in the fields. Women had been awake longer, grinding grain, drawing water from the cistern before the surface warmed, preparing food that could be eaten without fire during the hottest hours. The 6th hour, noon, was not lunchtime in the festive modern sense. It was a boundary, a wall, a moment when sensible people stopped moving. The roads emptied, the markets grew quiet, even animals sought shadow. This is why the encounter between Jesus and the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well is so quietly extraordinary. She came to draw water at the 6th hour, at noon, alone. Every other woman in the village came in the cool of the morning in groups. In the social hour of conversation and community, her presence at the well at the hottest, most isolating moment of the day was not accidental. It was the geography of shame made visible. And Jesus was sitting there, in the heat, waiting. He understood exactly what that hour meant, before the first brick was ever laid. The builders of ancient Judea had learned something that modern construction forgot for nearly a century, and is only now rediscovering. Stone breathes. The limestone used in virtually every structure in first-century Judea, the same pale, almost white stone that gives Jerusalem its luminous quality at sunset, had a thermal property that made it invaluable in a hot climate. It absorbed heat slowly during the day and released it slowly at night. A well-built stone house did not simply shelter its inhabitants from the sun. It actively regulated temperature, acting as a thermal buffer between the brutal exterior world and the interior space where families ate, slept and survived. The walls were thick, not because the builders lacked precision, but because thickness was the technology. In the villages of Galilee, walls of a typical domestic dwelling ran between 18 inches and 3 feet of solid limestone. Walking through a doorway in the heat of midday felt like stepping into a different season. The temperature drop was immediate, physical, almost shocking. Sound changed. Light changed. The air itself felt heavier and cooler against the skin. This was the second forgotten trick, building as climate control, designed not for aesthetics, but for survival. But the stone house was only part of the system. The orientation of the house mattered enormously. Doors and primary windows in homes throughout the region were positioned to face away from the direct western afternoon sun, the most punishing angle of summer light, and toward the northeast, where prevailing winds could be captured and channeled through the interior. Richer households in Jerusalem incorporated courtyards with small pools or cisterns at their center, not primarily for washing, but because standing water lowered the surrounding air temperature through evaporation. Even the narrow, winding street patterns of ancient villages were not random. They were aerodynamic. The close-set buildings created channels of shade and directed airflow in ways that made the streets, paradoxically, cooler than open spaces. Nothing in that world was accidental. Jesus taught in these streets. He walked through these shadows. When he described a man who built his house on rock rather than sand, the crowd did not think of it as a spiritual metaphor first. They thought of construction. They thought of the limestone foundations that kept a house cool, stable, and standing through the thermal expansion and contraction of extreme seasons. The spiritual meaning landed with force precisely because the physical meaning was so immediate and so personal. A poorly built house in that climate was not merely uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Infants, the elderly, and the sick died in houses that held heat rather than dispersed it. The difference between a well-oriented, thick-walled stone dwelling and a hastily assembled structure of mud brick could be, in a severe summer, the difference between life and death. The third forgotten trick lived inside the house itself, in the lowest room. In many homes throughout Judea and Galilee, the ground floor was shared, in the coolest months, with the family's animals. This arrangement, often misunderstood by modern readers as primitive or unhygienic, served a precise thermal function. Animal bodies generate heat. In winter, that heat was welcome. But the deeper logic was architectural. The ground floor, being partially below street level and insulated on multiple sides by earth and stone, was the coolest space in the structure. During extreme heat, this lower room became a refuge. It was where food was stored, where the sick were brought, where the very young and very old retreated when the sun reached its apex. When Luke describes the manger, the feeding trough, as the place where the infant Jesus was laid, he is describing this ground-level space, not a separate barn at the edge of a field, the lower room of a house, stone floor, thick walls, the coolest, most protected space available. Even the birthplace carried the logic of survival. There is a sound that defined summer mornings in first-century Judea more than any other. It was not birdsong. It was not the call to prayer. It was the sound of water being lifted, the wooden creak of a rope over stone, the hollow echo of a ceramic jar descending into darkness, the soft collision of water against clay when the vessel was pulled back up full. Water was not a comfort in that world. It was arithmetic. The fourth forgotten trick was water management, so precise and so disciplined that it bordered on ritual. A family cistern, the plastered underground chamber carved into the bedrock beneath or beside the house, was filled entirely during the rainy season, roughly October through March. From that stored volume, every drop consumed between spring and the first autumn rains had to be rationed, tracked, and protected. A household cistern in a modest Galilean home held roughly 10 to 15,000 liters. That sounds like abundance until you calculate daily consumption for drinking, minimal cooking, and the care of animals across 6 dry months. Waste was not merely frowned upon. It was a form of violence against the future. This is why the woman who lost 1 coin in the parable Jesus told searched with such absolute intensity, lighting a lamp, sweeping every corner, refusing to stop. The audience understood immediately that what was lost was not a trivial amount. In an economy of radical scarcity, a single coin represented a day's labor, a day's food, a day's water. The emotion in the parable was not exaggerated, it was precise. But water management was only the most visible layer of heat survival. Beneath it ran an equally sophisticated understanding of the body itself. The fifth forgotten trick was clothing, and it operated on principles that seem counterintuitive until you understand the physics. In extreme dry heat, the instinct of the modern mind is to remove clothing. Bare skin, we assume, is cooler. In the dry, solar radiation-intense environment of first-century Judea, that instinct was wrong, and the people who lived there knew it. Loose, full-length linen garments, the basic dress of both men and women across all social classes, functioned as a personal microclimate. The loose weave of undyed linen allowed air to circulate against the skin. The length and coverage blocked direct solar radiation, which heats the body far more aggressively than ambient air temperature. The light color, off-white, the natural tone of unbleached linen, reflected rather than absorbed sunlight. A laborer working in a field at midday in first-century Galilee, dressed in his full linen tunic and head covering, was physiologically cooler than a bare-skinned person beside him. The sweat his body produced was captured against the skin by the fabric, extending its evaporative cooling effect rather than evaporating immediately into the dry air and being wasted. When Jesus described the man who gave away his tunic, his innermost garment, he was describing a sacrifice so intimate and so practical that the crowd felt it physically. A tunic was not clothing in the decorative modern sense. It was temperature regulation. It was sun protection. It was the first line of defense between a human body and an environment that could kill it. To give it away was an act of radical, costly love. The sixth forgotten trick was shade, but not the passive shade of sitting under a tree. It was the active, collective, socially organized construction of shade as a shared resource. The marketplace in a first-century Judean town was not an open plaza baking under direct sun. It was a covered arcade. Woven reed mats, stretched linen canopies, and permanent stone overhangs created a layered ceiling of shade that transformed the market into a survivable environment during summer trading hours. The synagogue courtyard was oriented to maximize morning shade. The city gate, where elders sat to adjudicate disputes and conduct the business of community life, was positioned precisely to remain in shadow during the hottest portion of the day. Shade was infrastructure. It was as deliberately constructed and as socially important as the road itself. There is a moment in the Gospel of Mark, brief and easily overlooked, that suddenly becomes something else entirely when you understand the world it describes. Jesus and his disciples had been moving through crowds, teaching, healing, pressed on every side by bodies and noise and need. Mark records that Jesus said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." They got into a boat and crossed to a quieter shore. That was not a spiritual retreat metaphor. That was the seventh forgotten trick, the deliberate, disciplined seeking of cool air across open water. The Sea of Galilee, more precisely a freshwater lake approximately 13 miles long and 8 miles wide, sat in a basin surrounded by hills. During the brutal inland heat of summer, the water surface remained significantly cooler than the surrounding land. A light wind moved consistently across the lake, particularly in the morning and evening hours. Fishermen had known for generations that the water was not merely a source of food, it was a source of relief, the act of crossing the lake. Sitting low in a wooden boat with the water a few inches beneath you and the moving air against your face was one of the most effective forms of heat management available to a person in that landscape without access to wealth or architecture. Jesus chose the lake repeatedly, not only for its symbolic resonance, because he lived in a body, in a climate, in a world where that choice made physiological sense. The disciples who followed him were fishermen. They understood water temperature, wind patterns, and the particular mercy of shade cast by a boat's sail in the early afternoon. When Jesus slept in the stern of the boat during the storm, his exhaustion was not simply narrative detail. It was the exhaustion of a man who had spent hours in the heat, moving through crowds, with his body working harder than we remember to acknowledge. He was fully human. That means he was hot. That means he was thirsty. That means he understood, in his skin and his muscles and his dry throat, exactly what he was offering when he stood at the temple during the Feast of Tabernacles, a harvest festival held at the end of summer when the memory of heat and thirst was still present in every body in the crowd, and called out in a loud voice, "If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink." This was not abstract theology landing on comfortable, air-conditioned listeners. This was a man who had walked the same roads they walked, under the same sun, with the same vulnerability. He had felt the shower of wind steal moisture from his lips. He had sought shade at the 6th hour. He had worn linen against his skin and drawn water from cisterns, and crossed the lake to find cooler air. He spoke those words into bodies that had been managing thirst their entire lives. Bodies that knew exactly what it cost to run out of water in July. Bodies that understood, with a precision we have lost, what it meant to find a source that would never run dry. And that is the moment when the ancient world and the eternal word collapse into a single point of recognition. The tricks were never just tricks. The stone walls, the cisterns, the linen garments, the organized shade, the timing of movement, the crossing of cool water, they were the accumulated wisdom of generations, learning how to keep human beings alive in a harsh and beautiful land. Jesus did not float above that wisdom. He was formed by it, shaped by it, and he spoke through it. His words were born in real heat, real thirst, and real stone. That is not a reduction of their meaning. It is the deepest possible confirmation of it. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and flesh in first-century Judea meant knowing how to survive the summer.